So I want to begin with a little bit of an introduction about technology, and then we're going to really try to do some thinking about Rabbis Heschel and Soloveitchik and how they might or might not be able to guide us. So we live, for better and for worse, in a technological society, which means that much of who we are and of what we are has been dramatically amplified. What I mean by that is that our potential to heal and to do good, and on the other hand, our capacity to hurt and to inflict suffering, have both reached unprecedented levels. That's the moment in history in which we live. We can cure diseases that were unimaginable, that would have been unimaginable to cure, and we can inflict suffering in ways that we could never have dreamed of. We can cure disease and despoil the earth. We can talk to and comfort people on the other end of the globe, and some of us at least have been entrusted with the power to obliterate people without so much as getting out of our chairs. So in some deep way, we remain always who we have been, only more so, right? Creatures legitimately capable of building and destroying worlds. But I want to ask the following question as a way of moving us into our topic. Does technology really only amplify who we already were? Or does it in some fundamental way transform who we are? Look at the quote in italics at the top of your page from the British philosopher George Pattison. He says, "Technology is not just something that mediates between our mental intentions and the physical world about us. Technology gets inside our heads and affects the very way in which we conceive reality." Technology gets inside our heads and affects the very way in which we conceive reality. So by engaging with the thought of Rabbis Heschel and Soloveitchik, I want to ask a couple of questions. How does technology shape and reshape who we are? How does it reshape our minds and our hearts? And then crucially, how does it broaden our vision and how does it constrict it? In order to think about Heschel and Soloveitchik on technology, I have to say just a few sentences about the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who was the great philosopher of technology in the 20th century. And I'll say as a footnote to this, because I think it's kind of fascinating, there is a great book to be written about how all great modern Jewish thinkers in the 20th century are engaged in an extremely deep conversation with Martin Heidegger's writing, which is enormously influential upon them, and the fact of which drives them crazy. Because Heidegger was one of the greatest philosophers, arguably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and one of the worst human beings of the 20th century, right? An unrepentant Nazi, really an unrepentant Nazi. And it's fascinating. Heschel, Soloveitchik, Buber, everyone is sort of wrestling with the enormous impact Heidegger has on them. Heidegger argues that technology has dramatically altered the way we interact with the world. In the modern world, he says we engage in what he calls, I'll explain what this means in a second, calculative thinking. Calculative thinking. That is, we imagine that everything in the world is a resource available for our exploitation and manipulation. The dominant question that overtakes our lives is, how can I use this? In one of Heidegger's most famous sentences, he writes, "Nature has become a gigantic gasoline station, an energy source for modern technology and industry." Nature as having its own value, in other words, he thinks deteriorates in the culture of technology. Is he overstating the point? So I included in the packet, if you look at the first source, the first non-italicized source, a contemporary philosopher, Richard Pulte, writing an introduction to Heidegger, says the following thing, which I think is actually both clever and actually potentially quite insightful. When we look at today's language, we can see that there is something to what Heidegger is saying. Natural things are routinely called natural resources. Human beings are human resources. Books and artworks become information resources. And writing becomes word processing, as if language, too, were just a resource to be manipulated. In other words, everything begins to be imagined as, how can it be used? So it's crucial to emphasize, because if we don't get this, we will, I think, misunderstand everything Heidegger is saying, and more importantly, everything Heschel is saying. The problem is not technology itself. The problem is the technological way of seeing and responding to the world. It's not whether or not I have this gadget or that. It's what a certain culture elicits from me. And I'll try to explain what that means in just a moment. Why is the technological way of seeing the world so dangerous, according to Heidegger? Because if we focus exclusively on exploiting and manipulating the world, we lose any sense of openness to and receptivity towards the world, or any sense that anything outside me has any value other than in how it can serve me. Everything becomes measured by, is it useful? The difference between Heschel and Heidegger is the difference, as we say in traditional Jewish language, mimizrach el ma'arav. It is from east to west. On this crucial point, for Heschel, what is most dangerous about technological culture is a loss of openness to others and to God. Because even other people and God, as we'll see, become tools for me to exploit. For Heidegger, there's some other point here that is very hard to follow. We lose our mystical connection to being, and no one has ever really been sure exactly what Heidegger means by that. So Heschel learned a lot from Heidegger, but he also moved beyond him into a much more Jewish way of thinking about this. So let's take a few minutes to think about what he's saying. Heschel famously argues, and in many ways I would suggest, and I've become sort of more convinced about this over the years from working on Heschel, that if you asked him, what is it that you want to say to the modern world? Right? What is your message about what ails human beings in the modern world? I think Heschel would have said something like this. There are two ways of being in the world. Life is a struggle between self-assertion on the one hand, the impulse to say I, and self-transcendence on the other, the impulse to say you. You can look at, we won't read together, sources 1 and 2 under Heschel. This is a moment-to-moment struggle. No one ever transcends their ego and says, my entire life is focused on other people. Anyone who tells you that is usually either lying or deluded, right? And I think that's actually really true. I always tell students, this is like totally obscene thing to say, but I really think it's true. Anytime you hear a spiritual teacher say, I've transcended the ego, you always have to do two things. Number one, make sure you know where your money is. Number two, make sure you know where your daughter is. Because people like that are either con artists or totally deluded. I really mean that very seriously. Like I can't say anything more sincerely than that. It's really important to keep that in mind because it is a moment-to-moment struggle. If that sounds abstract, think about moments in your own life where you've been incredibly kind to someone and 5 minutes later you find yourself like thinking, wait a minute, the way I just behaved, is that the same person who 5 minutes ago was nice to someone? Or maybe more subtly, you're in the middle of doing something kind for someone, and all of a sudden you find yourself admiring yourself for your kindness. No one in this room has any idea what I'm talking about. That's obvious, right? But in other words, it's a constant struggle to decenter my own ego. It's not about me. It's not about me. It's not about me. And then that voice that says, look how wonderful I am. I know it's not about me. Right? That's the struggle, okay? Heschel calls these two ways of being in the world the way of wonder, on the one hand, and the way of expediency on the other. And this will lead us directly into technology. What is the way of wonder, essentially, in a sentence? Wonder is the realization that none of this had to be. I didn't earn my life. I didn't earn the existence of the world. And so when I realize how much I've been given, I feel grateful and I feel indebted and I want to repay. In the language of Hallel, Ma'ashiv ladonai kol tagmuloi alai. How could I possibly repay for all these wonders that I've received? No one ever invented their own capacity to love. Right? The way of expediency, on the other hand, is what we might call the path of entitlement, or as Israelis inimitably say, magia li. Right? What do you mean? Why do I have this? Because I deserve it. It's mine, and I want more. And rather than giving, I want to take, acquire, possess. If you look at the last sentence of source 4 for a minute, Heschel says, there is more than one aspect of nature that commands our attention. We go out to meet the world not only by way of expediency, but also by way of wonder. In the first, we accumulate information in order to dominate. That's expediency. In the second, we deepen our appreciation in order to respond. That's wonder. That is what allows Heschel to write what I think is one of the key sentences in everything he ever said. Mankind will not perish for want of information, but only for want of appreciation. Right? Mankind will not perish for want of information. What we know is endless, but for want of appreciation, the realization that I owe something. So the way of expediency, in other words, closes us off to what is outside us. And the way of wonder, in contrast, brings us into fellowship with other people and other beings and other things. What does all this have to do with living in the age of the iPad, right? Heschel argues that the way of wonder, the way of expediency are just given with human nature. We always have these choices before us, but modernity, he thinks, takes the culture of expediency, the way of expediency, amps it up, puts it on steroids, and makes it the only thing we know. How? How does it do that? Because the culture of technology means that we come to see the world not as a wonder and a marvel, but as a giant opportunity to get what we want. That the way, when Pattison talks about how technology enters our head and fundamentally affects how we see, Heschel thinks that what that means is the question that orients our life becomes different. And by the way, we could talk later if we have the time, or I'm happy afterwards. You know, is this actually something that is unique to the modern world? Or is Pattison said this in the last 5 years. Heschel was writing in these sentences in the early 1950s, which is amazing. You know, I would say to make the non-radical point here, things have gotten worse in that extreme, not better. So look at source 3, where Heschel says this, right? Our age is one in which usefulness is thought to be the chief merit of nature. Usefulness. Man has become primarily a tool-making animal, and the world is now a gigantic toolbox for the satisfaction of his needs. In other words, expediency rules the day. The modern question, Heschel thinks, is not how can I respond, but how can I use this? And you can look at the rest of source 4 that we already talked about. So there's 2 steps here. How does wonder die in people? One is always there. It's essentially routine. It is very hard to be constantly surprised by and newly invigorated by that which becomes familiar. Right? That's the change from waking up in the morning and doing what Judaism traditionally says, opening our eyes and saying grateful, which is what modeh or modah mean, as opposed to opening our eyes and saying this again. Right? It's very hard. Routine makes it very, very hard. One of the great paradoxes of Jewish spirituality is the insistence that it is a fixed liturgy that is most capable of reawakening our sense of newness and surprise. I think the jury is out on whether the American synagogue bears that out. Right? I don't think the jury is actually out on that, but I'm trying to be polite, right? It's a huge challenge. It is the paradox of Jewish spirituality that keva, fixed structure, is actually Judaism's chosen means to elicit kavanah. That we could spend a lot of time with in the history of Judaism and in our own lives, because I'm guessing we could find ways in our own life that it's specifically structure that elicits our being present, and ways in which structure actually works the other way too. It's a very hard issue. But routinization is dangerous stuff. I remember in the most self-righteous moment of my life, which is really saying something for those of you who know me, I was a rabbi on campus, and I walked into the dining hall one day, and I walked up to the chef, who was someone I was friendly with, and I said, hey, how are you? And he said, same stuff, different day. He didn't say stuff, but you get my point. And I had this, I did not actually do this, but I had the urge to scream, no, different day, new stuff, right? That's the whole point, right? It's very, very hard to move away from that. So routinization says that you don't need modernity for that. You just need life. You just need the alarm clock going off at the same time every day. But then, and this is where modernity makes it worse, is what Heschel calls instrumentalization. That is, people worship at the altar of how the world can serve them. I always tell students, and I'm never sure that they totally understand what I mean by that one of the single most important spiritual lessons they can learn is that the world is not your waiter. The world is not your way. Not everything exists in order to give you what you want. Now, Heschel also makes the argument, and then I wanted to develop this totally fascinating argument, which I think once he says, you can sort of see how it might be obvious. He says that the problem of expediency is that it's essentially a boomerang. That when you basically treat everything else as essentially there to use and exploit, eventually you treat yourself as not really intrinsically valuable either. No one can go through life believing nothing else in the world but me has value. Because at the end of the day, you degrade yourself in the process. Look at source 5 for a second. He who sets out to employ the realities of life as means for satisfying his own desires will soon forfeit his freedom and be degraded to a mere tool. Acquiring things, he becomes enslaved to them. Sound like anyone you've ever met? Sound like us in certain moments? Acquiring things, we become enslaved to them. In subduing others, he loses his own soul. It is as if unchecked covetousness were double-faced, a sneer and subtle vengeance behind a captivating smile. I love that, by the way, for a person who learned English at 29. But my view of the world, source 6, and my understanding of the self determine each other. The complete manipulation of the world results in the complete instrumentalization of the self. Now, I want to take this and make this a little more radical and maybe even a little offensive in certain ways. In the culture of technology, Heschel argues, even religion is valued only because it can serve us. Now, we find this right now unfolding in the American Jewish community in ways that some of you have heard me talk about before. I find really distressing, where people have begun to talk about Jewish rituals as, quote, spiritual technologies. People try to convince Jews to engage with Judaism by asking how it can serve them, right? I recently picked up a book about Musar, which is all about ethical self-cultivation. It's a very lovely book, but in the introduction, the author almost can't help himself. He ends the introduction by saying, and so I invite you to ask how Musar can serve you. That's exactly wrong. I invite you to ask whether Judaism can teach you that that's the wrong question. That actually life is at least in large part about asking, how can I serve? Right? That would be truly countercultural Judaism. So what ends up happening is, of course, when rabbis talk this way, is that they think that the reason they're talking that way is because that's how they're going to get people in. But of course, what happens in the process is that they become more like the culture they're trying to change than the culture becomes like them, because they're selling Judaism as a product. I was recently at a conference where a rabbi started talking about the problem of American Judaism is poor delivery systems. I can't even, this is on camera. I can't tell you the words that went through my mind when I heard this, right? So look at source 7 for a minute. The essence of religion does not lie in the satisfaction of a human need. As long as man sees religion as a source of satisfaction for his own needs, it is not God whom he serves, but his own self. The question really is, do we think of religion as a way to have God bless our comforts? Or do we see religion as about a God who tears our selfishness to pieces? That's like the perennial question of religion, right? Is God about sanctifying all the status that I already have? Not only am I wealthy and powerful, but God loves me for it? Or is religion about, wow, there are widows and orphans in this society and I claim to worship God? It's very hard. It's very, very hard. That's the challenge. And Heschel thinks that modernity, the culture of technology, again, not necessarily technology, the culture of technology even makes religion about serving me. Heschel thinks that it is this endless self-assertion, this I. By the way, it is not meaningless that all the most desired products in our culture are called iPods, iPads, iMacs. That's not a joke. By the way, marketers are not stupid. They're not stupid. There's something very deep about that. And Heschel thinks that all of this has made unprecedented callousness and cruelty possible, right? That's essentially his argument, is that because nothing matters unless it can serve me, if you're in pain, it makes no claim on me, let alone someone far away from me. Why does it matter? Right? People are drowning in boats. So what? How does that affect my plans? It doesn't. So he thinks that one of his great phrases is he says, in his essays about civil rights, he talks about human beings in modernity are callous to catastrophes. And he thinks one of the things that makes us callous to catastrophes is this culture of expediency. You can't do anything for me. You're not useful to me. There was a time, by the way, I have no idea, this is not a literature I know anything about anymore. There was a time when in the scholarship on genocide, sociologists used to talk about surplus peoples. They're essentially peoples who came to be seen as no longer valuable. It's exactly this. You have no value for us. There's no intrinsic dignity that you carry as by dint of being human. It's a horrible phrase, right? That's a phrase that should make every hair on your body stand up, right? So what Heschel thinks is urgent is a reorientation so that we discover that life is not primarily about claims I make, but about responding to claims made on me, right? He thinks that that orientation is what is most distinctive about religion done right. And we should underline that done right 1,000,000 times. Because we all know that religion can in fact do the opposite, as we just saw, right? Religion can make us far more callous than we ever were before. Look for just a minute at source 9. I just want to sort of share this with you to make the point that I'm not trying to do an apology for Heschel here. The solution of mankind's most vexing problem will not be found in renouncing technical civilization, but in attaining some degree of independence of it, which is why he sees Shabbat as an antidote to what ails modernity. Because essentially, what is Shabbat theologically? It is a decision not to act upon the world, but instead to let it register with me, right? I can't build things on Shabbat. So I just made a mention in passing, just before we leave Heschel behind, that even God becomes a tool in many ways, right? And maybe this is part and parcel of religion, but Heschel points out, those of you who, at any point studied philosophy in college or in grad school or whatever, will perhaps recognize this. Heschel says, how do most modern philosophers use God? When they have a problem in their philosophical system, they invoke God to make it work. Like even intellectuals do this, right? Kant says, how do I guarantee that it's worthwhile to pursue the moral good? Well, because God is a kind of guarantor. And there's a great postmodern Christian philosopher who says, God is not, all caps, the one who makes our systems work, right? God is the one who makes a claim on us. Heschel has this wonderful thing that he says, it's totally beautiful, it's beautiful and it's profound. He says, philosophers of religion preoccupy themselves with a set of human questions about God. But religion is not about that at all. Religion is about a set of divine questions to us. Not questions about God, but questions from God, right? God in search of man, that title is a translation, essentially for Heschel, of the question, Ayeka, where are you? The opening question of the Bible in many ways. Where are you? Okay, now, Joseph Soloveitchik read all this, and I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, thought, you've lost your mind. Because I understand that modernity and the culture of technology means that we can build gas chambers, but we can also build cancer wards. And where is that in the way you think about this? So, Halachic Man, a book that Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote in 1944, is not explicitly about technology at all, but its second part is about something related. It's about the idea that human beings are created to themselves become creators. That is, fascinatingly for Soloveitchik, he is the first person in the history of Jewish thought to say this, the primary meaning of being created in God's image. God is a creator, and we, created in God's image, are similarly tasked with being creators. And by extension, it's also the meaning of the biblical mandate of walking in God's ways, right? Just as God creates worlds, so should we. And for those of you who find this kind of thing interesting, it's amazing what Soloveitchik does. He takes an idea that was dominant in the Misnagdic yeshiva world he came from, the Lithuanian world of yeshiva learning, where the pinnacle of what a person could do was create new things in the Beit Midrash, the culture of what's called chidushim. And Soloveitchik essentially, don't overinterpret this word, secularizes that insight and says, why should we limit it to the Beit Midrash in an age when we have power? What about the biology lab? What about the social policy center? Right? If there's a value in being creators, it's not limited to Torah. Torah, after all, is about the world. So human beings are asked to be creators. One of the reasons I actually like reading these passages with Jews, young Jews who don't come from Orthodox background, is it explodes every horrible stereotype they have about Orthodoxy. Because they basically say, here's the great modern Orthodox thinker of the 20th century. You know what he thinks the essence of Judaism is? Creativity. This is not their stereotypes, ever, which is quite fascinating, right? So not everyone agrees with my understanding of what he's saying here, but I think it's pretty clear that he's saying that creativity is meant to be all over the world. You can look at source 1 if you were interested, and then look at source 2 for a minute. This very dramatic claim: halachic man discerns in every divine pledge man's obligation to bring about its fulfillment. In every promise, a specific norm. In every eschatological vision, a vision for the end of the world. An everlasting commandment, the commandment to participate in the realization of the prophecy. If we had a lot of time, we could just think about this one sentence. Basically, Soloveitchik is saying every time God promises anything, we're supposed to make it happen. I just want to mention this is classic Soloveitchik. He is saying something here that is totally radical, right? And he says it as if it's just matter-of-fact true, no debate. Why am I saying that? Because the entire culture of Haredi anti-Zionism is based on believing that this sentence, I mean, not this sentence, but the idea behind this sentence is satanic rebellion against God. Right? What is Satmar theology all about? God says, I will bring you back to the land and I will redeem you. That means you wait. And here Soloveitchik is saying, matter of fact, no, what does it mean? It means God says, I will bring you back. Make it happen. Okay? I have often thought, I don't mean this in any way disrespectfully, on the contrary, if I gave out this sentence to a scholar of modern Jewish thought without its reference, they would probably say, yeah, some middle of the century American Reform rabbi. Right? This notion of every time God promises, you do it. Right? But Soloveitchik is so focused on human agency, so focused on it, that this becomes obvious to him. What is so striking about Soloveitchik is the insistence that when, actually, let me say it this way. What is so striking here is that the insistence is that in theory, the culture of technology can help us cure disease and bring redemption closer. I often find myself thinking, right, we should mark time from the advent of penicillin. Right? I mean, literally, talk about like cosmic, seismic, whatever we want to do. Like everything is different. What is so striking, though, about halachic man, and frankly, given that it's written in 1944, it's really jarring, is how wildly optimistic it is. Human beings were created to be creators, and we can, and we should. None of what you find if you read Soloveitchik's later writings is anywhere to be found in this book. There's no dialectic, there's no sense of surrender, there's no sense of, but human beings are also really dangerous. It's actually almost a veneration of the human being as creator. You could imagine Heschel reading Halachic Man and saying, what are you smoking? What are you talking about? Now, I would say, by the way, and maybe this is a helpful way of framing it, it's always seemed to me that the Holocaust landed with Heschel much earlier than it did with Soloveitchik. Is it clear what I mean by that? By the early 1950s, already actually by the 40s, 39 really, Heschel is talking about everything's different now, right? Everything's different now. The world is an inferno. Soloveitchik is 1944. He's totally not there. Human beings are creators. We can build the world. It's only later. And that is a kind of big divide in American Jewry in general. Historians are now fighting about what year it was when American Jews began to actually take in the Holocaust, which is hard for us, from our perspective, to look back on. For a long time, historians argued that until Elie Wiesel published Night, American Jews were basically in this kind of post-traumatic silence. That view is now, a lot of people disagree with that view now, but I don't think it's so shocking if it's true that in 1944, Soloveitchik philosophically, it hasn't percolated yet. Just think about, God forbid, think about one of the worst moments of your life where something happened and you did not expect and nothing was the same. It's not like you woke up the next morning, you're like, okay, how do I put my life back together now? Or how does this affect my worldview? You're basically still, right, numb, trying to figure out very concrete tasks, if you can do that, right? So I think it's really striking that a Jew from Eastern Europe can write this in 1944. So Heschel says, essentially, yes, you can build cancer wards, but you can also build gas chambers and nuclear bombs. Where, in all of your celebration as person, as creator, do you make space for the horrifying reality that human beings are also, right, unimaginable destroyers? I think the point here is that what technology means is that the more it makes human beings creators, it also makes us destroyers. You really can't have one without the other, given the reality of human nature. And halachic man makes no gesture to even understanding that. By the way, just a sort of footnote to this that I think is interesting, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end. Unlike the Soloveitchik of halachic man, many modern thinkers, and especially in recent years, have been wrestling with the ways that human freedom is actually curtailed rather than just expanded by technology. There's a contemporary philosopher of technology, David Lewin, who says the following: "We are at the mercy of unprecedented and unnatural forces that have been unleashed by our hubris or simply by lack of care." Let me give you a very concrete example of this, which I'm going to try to say apolitically. Imagine that we all got together and decided, you know what, it did a lot of good, but global capitalism has consequences that are such that we might want to dismantle parts of it. Just imagine that scenario. Forget about what your politics are for a minute. How should we do that? Let's dismantle the structures that run Wall Street. I mean, they're created by people, right? How do we take it apart? How do we dismantle it? Most people who are honest would say, I don't have the faintest clue. It's bigger than I am. It's bigger than all of us are. That's what philosophers of technology have started to talk about, that we've made things. If that sounds like a lefty example, I'm happy to think of a righty one. I don't care about that at all in this context. I'm just saying there's all the time, technological, all kinds of biomedical possibilities, right, that seem like they're bigger than we are, right? So they are the consequence of our creativity, but they actually serve, philosophers have started to argue, to curtail our freedom even as they expand it. It's actually kind of fascinating to wrestle with. So I would suggest that Heschel and the Soloveitchik of halachic man can best be read as counterpoints to another, right? The way that I sometimes think of this, and I hope this doesn't sound flip, is that Soloveitchik essentially looks at the modern world and says, look what we can do. And Heschel says, my God, I'm looking. Look what we can do. Now, I'll take one more step, and then we can have a back and forth about this. 20 years later, Soloveitchik writes a book called The Lonely Man of Faith, which is philosophically a much more mature book. And I want to just mention two pieces of it because I think they're really fascinating. He argues that a person of faith is to some degree always out of place in modern, secular, technological society. Look, if you will, at source 6 for a minute. He says, Adam the first is interested in just a single aspect of reality and asks one question only: how does the cosmos function? He is not fascinated by the question, why does the cosmos function at all? Nor is he interested in the question, what is the essence? He is only curious to know how it works. In fact, even this how question with which Adam the first is preoccupied is limited in scope. He is concerned not with the question per se, but with its practical implications. He raises not a metaphysical, but a practical, technical how question. How does this work? No deeper question than that. Adam the first is overwhelmed by one quest, namely to harness and dominate the elemental natural forces and to put them at his disposal. This practical interest arouses his will to learn the secrets of nature. He is completely utilitarian, what I called before instrumental, as far as motivation, teleology, design, and methodology are concerned. In other words, modernity rules out most of the questions that a genuinely religious person asks. What is the texture of the thing that I'm seeing? What is the meaning of this encounter? What does it mean to really sit with another person in pain? What is the qualitative as opposed to the quantitative dimension of my experience? Soloveitchik argues now, right, in a way that sounds like Heschel, that modern society pushes that question off of our tables. Okay? Look for a moment at source 7. So that's why we need Adam 2, who is uncomfortable in modernity, or is somewhat alien to it. Adam II does not apply the functional method invented by Adam I. He does not create a world of his own. Instead, he wants to understand the living given world into which he has been cast. Therefore, he does not mathematize phenomena or conceptualize things. He encounters the universe in all its colorfulness, splendor, and grandeur, and studies it with naivete, awe, sound like wonder, right? And admiration of the child who seeks the unusual and wonderful in every ordinary thing and event. It's almost like Soloveitchik has been reading Heschel, right? While Adam I is dynamic and creative, transforming sensory data into thought constructs, Adam II is receptive and beholds the world in its original dimension. Adam I and Adam II, the technological creator on the one hand and the appreciator on the other, have incommensurate ways of seeing the world. They can't be fully integrated. And it's not just what they do. I really want to underline that. It's how they see. Soloveitchik says, Adam I forms communities, but they're about getting things done. They're not communities of commitment. They're not about holding each other through suffering and celebrating life with one another. They're about, right, getting things done. So he argues there in ways that I think are really moving, and they really provide a fascinating and important window into our modern challenge, which is he says, yes, dignity, human dignity comes from the ability to do things, agency. But the redemption of a person comes from our ability to restrain ourselves, right? And in many ways, you can say every debate in our society about medical ethics, probably not every debate, but an awful lot of them are essentially about where is the proper line between where agency should be used and where it should be stopped. And you can kind of create a political spectrum there, right? You know, are stem cells, the stem cell research, the greatest thing that ever happened that allows us to become fully human, or are they horrific attempts to usurp the divine? I'm not interested in what the answers are right now, obviously, right? And you can ask this question about almost every technology we develop. It's, to be clear, Soloveitchik thinks both are necessary. The answer is not just to appreciate and not to create. After all, as we saw, he thinks being a creator is integral to what it means to being created in God's image, right? But it's how do we find a way to live with both? And he argues fascinatingly that one of the central roles of halakha in our life is to facilitate both of those things, both the capacity to build and the capacity to respond. Now, I want to say the last thing about Soloveitchik is that when he starts talking about religion in this book, he sounds just like Heschel, only in a way it's even more cutting. So look at source 9 for a minute. This is an amazing paragraph. I think it's one of the great paragraphs in modern Jewish thought. Notwithstanding the fact that Western man is in a nostalgic mood, he is determined not to accept the dialectical burden of humanity. He certainly feels spiritually uprooted, emotionally disillusioned, and like the old king of Ecclesiastes, he is aware of his own tragedy. Yet this pensive mood does not arouse him to heroic action. He, of course, comes to a place of worship. He attends lectures on religion and appreciates the ceremonial. Yet he is searching not for a faith in all its singularity and otherness, but for religious culture. This, by the way, I think is an amazing description of American Judaism, right? It's a religious culture. You know that famous joke? I recently told this to a room of 18-year-olds. None of them had ever heard this joke, which I found to be very sad, right? You know, Goldberg goes to shul to talk to God. I go to shul to talk to Goldberg. That's religious culture, right? That's religious culture. Right? You never heard that either? Amazing, okay? He seeks not the greatness found in sacrificial action, but the convenience one discovers in a comfortable, serene state of mind. He is desirous of an aesthetic experience rather than a covenantal one, of a social ethos rather than a divine imperative. In a word, he wants to find in faith that which he cannot find in his laboratory or in the privacy of his luxurious home. His efforts are noble, yet he is not ready for a genuine faith experience which requires the giving of oneself unreservedly to God, who demands unconditional commitment, sacrificial action, and retreat. Western man diabolically insists on being successful. Alas, he wants to be successful even in his adventure with God. If he gives himself to God, he expects reciprocity. He also reaches a covenant with God, but this covenant is a mercantile one. In a primitive manner, he wants to trade favors and exchange goods. I mean, that paragraph could have been written by Heschel, right? It's essentially, even religion becomes about, right, what can I get? So there's a few things I would like to say in closing, but I want to hold them and just take some comments, questions, thoughts about this so far. Does this speak to your, either about this or on a meta level, does this speak to your experience of what it means to be alive in the modern world? Please. So, I think you're asking a really great question. Sorry to cut you off. I just want to say one fun to this, which is, you know, I had a student once who prided herself on her kind of enormously curmudgeonly comments in my class. I remember once her saying, that'll be you, she said, you know, modern people are so self-congratulatory that they even think all their problems are uniquely modern. And the fact is, their problems are that they're human. Now, I think what Heschel might have said to you, and at the end of the day, this is going to become an irresolvable problem. Heschel would have said, you know, at a certain point, modernity makes our ability to behave this way so much more powerful that it becomes a difference in kind and not just in degree. As my late mother would have said, o shekain, o shelo, right? He might be right, he might not be right. I think Heschel, in the end of the day, will not be that invested in modernity invents the propensity out of whole cloth. That's what he's trying to say when he said, right, that the way of expediency has always been there, but modernity sort of foments it. I'm not sure he's right either. But I think at the end of the day, he's not a historian of culture. He's a philosopher trying to say something about, wait a minute, look what we've become. Go ahead. In my book on Heschel, I quoted this line in Nietzsche that I totally love. Nietzsche says, "In a time of emergency, it is necessary to philosophize with a hammer." It's an enormously important sentence, and I think it's an extremely important window into Heschel. Why does he say at times these completely outrageous things? Right? Why does Heschel say, right, in the 1950s, anyone who denies the possibility of God lays a perjury on his soul? It's quite a sentence, right? It's not exactly what we'd call like pluralistic and warm-hearted. I think Heschel is essentially saying, we live in a world that is so close to the possibility of transcendence that I'm going to grab you by the lapel and I'm going to shake you. And one of the things that took me a while to realize about Heschel is that what he says in a book might not be the same thing he would say over coffee with one person at Starbucks. Right? People philosophize with a hammer when they think the world is falling apart. Then it becomes our challenge, how do we read them? And one of the consequences of that is that some sentences age better than others. Right? I think some of those sentences in Heschel, in our increasingly secular time, sound shrill rather than jolting. Right? And that's a dilemma. Now, I also would say you have to be careful about judging a thinker writing in 1955 and thinking that modernity is uniquely off the rails. It's 1950. Actually, some of these sentences are 1951, right? When you're living in the immediate wake of the Shoah, you're a little nuts if you don't think that things are categorically different than they've ever been before. A little more time has passed now. We are able to sit in Westchester County in 2015, 16, whatever we're in, and think this through. In other words, I think you also have to wrestle with the time. Right? I think that's actually really, really important. Now, in terms of the question of people coming to shul and getting something out of it, neither Heschel nor Soloveitchik thinks you have to be a virtuoso with control of all of Western civilizations. I would say, on the contrary, Heschel is actually, the funny thing about what Heschel's saying is that it's actually enormously simple. He's basically saying, do God and other people make a claim on you? Does the suffering of the person you see make a claim on you that you don't have a right to walk away from? At the end of the day, it's not that complicated. It's just very hard. Right? So it's not about, you don't have to, this is something that I struggle with a lot speak very personally, something I struggle with a lot in traditional Jewish culture. As someone who founded a yeshiva, who spends an awful lot of my time learning or trying to find the time to learn and teaching texts, I am very nervous about the ways that some aspects of traditional culture, Jewish culture, are so focused on learning that certain conversations become dismissed as cute. Right? Like I say to students at Hadar all the time, so hanging out at Yeshiva Hadar in the Beit Midrash, have you learned to love more deeply while being here? And if you haven't, why are you still here? Why are you wasting your time? Why would you do that? Now, do you have to master Nietzsche and Heidegger to understand that? No, you don't. But the aspiration for deep emotional transformation that lies at the heart of genuine religion, I think is very, very deep. So I don't think Heschel or Soloveitchik would mind, if Shmulevich wants to talk to Goldberg. But if Shmulevich just thinks this is another way to have his needs met, right? I call this the culture of Kiddush. It's wonderful, but it doesn't make me a kinder person. And if religion is not engaged in that work, it's not doing what it's in the world to do. It's not responding. Does that mean it has no value? No. Does it have the value that ultimately it aspires to have? Also no. And we ought to struggle towards that. And I think we live in a time, for all kinds of reasons, where rabbis, to the extent that they feel it, are often very afraid of talking like that. I work with rabbis. It's kind of one of the things I do for a living. The culture of fear among rabbis is very deep. I mean, we live in a time where you may have noticed that both the American Jewish community and America writ large, we no longer have anything called discourse. We just have incredible toxicity, right? I have heard rabbis who are big left-wingers on Israel and rabbis who are big right-wingers on Israel in the last 6 months say to me, I'm not talking about Israel in my pulpit anymore. I'm sitting in front of a bunch of lunatics. I'm not going to do it, right? That's very, very hard. And one of the things I think religion would make possible, actually, is really deep, hard conversations. It's very, very hard. It's really very hard. One of the things it requires is vulnerability, right? I might be wrong. I might have something to learn from someone who threatens me in some way with their commitments and assumptions. So again, it's not like it's horrible to come to shul, but we shouldn't settle for what they're saying is very good. Shouldn't settle for religion as middle-class hobby. It's not enough. It's not that that's inherently valueless, but it is definitely not enough. In a world where people die of starvation all the time, in a world where people end up dead on the streets of New York, right, it's not enough. It's not enough. And that's really the core point. Like, does religion ask you to do one step more than you feel comfortable doing? It's true about ritual, but it's also true about ethics. And I think it's really important to both of them. And it's very hard. It's a very hard sell. We are amazing at domesticating. Here's the most interesting example of this, and I hope this doesn't sound, I find every year, I find myself really embarrassed by the Haftarah of Yom Kippur. Because the Haftarah of Yom Kippur is probably the most chutzpahdik thing the rabbis ever did. You're finally getting hungry. You're really, becoming kvetchy. And essentially, you get up, right, and someone says, by the way, God has a message for you. Get out of here. This is just all BS. Give me a break. Unless you're really working, right, to liberate those who are suffering and to comfort those who are in pain, I don't have any idea what you're even doing here. And you know what we do? We tell the person who just came down from the bima, you chant so beautifully. I mean, that's just total domestication of what religion is. It's very, very, that's what they're talking about. And I think that that's real and worth wrestling with in a really, really deep and powerful way. It is very hard. It's also the case, and I think this is something that, in my own writing, I've been trying to find ways to say this. The ability to constantly hear religious messages and assume that they are meant as criticisms of people I don't like either is so deep, right? What does religion come to do? To say that all the people who don't share my politics are not only wrong, they're evil. Right? This runs very deep in our culture. One of my favorite jokes ever, it's really an amazing joke. A rabbi gets up on Yom Kippur, and for 45 minutes he harangues the congregation. You're all immoral, you're horrible, you're corrupt, you're basely materialistic, you're disgusting. Musaf ends, the entire congregation is lined up, and every one of them says the same thing to him. Yishar Koach, Rabbi, you really told them. That's an amazing window on religion, right? That's the danger of religion, right? The danger of religion is it confirms all my biases. This is hard stuff. I'm sorry, that was an extremely long-winded response. Yeah, please. Some of the urge to use technology in prayer strikes me as, in part, stemming from an extremely unreflective sense of what Shabbat is supposed to be in the first place. There are exceptions to that, right? Here's a really interesting example where you have even Haredi poskim finding ways, where someone who's deaf, right, can use amplification systems, right? That's different. But saying, as one rabbi recently did before a major convention of Jews, why don't we not have Sidurim? Everyone just bring your iPad to davening. I'm thinking, have you thought about what the implications of that might be? Right? Not the implications that you want. What are the implications that you haven't thought about? This is one of the ways where I think religion... See, it's funny. There's a deep tension in Judaism. This is a little oversimplified, but between, I would call it a prophetic impulse and a halachic impulse. The prophetic impulse essentially says, wait a minute, this is broken. This cannot be. The halachic impulse says, you know what? How about we think that through slowly? Because you know what happens when people try to enact revolutions? They often make things worse. So if you think that it's a problem that American Jews are not experiencing Shabbat, and you think the answer is to allow them to bring their iPads to shul, I don't know. That doesn't strike me as so thoughtful. It just doesn't strike me as thoughtful. Forget about the halachic questions of whether it's asur or mutar. Forget about that. I'm not great. The people who will quote me now as saying I said forget about that. I'm saying forget about that for this moment, right? Even if it were totally halachically, technically solvable, what are you doing in the process of saying that? Right? So I think there are really important questions to ask. Yes, velocity is a very big deal here. I think this is very, very hard. One of the things, and here I might sound like some kind of apologist for all kinds of small c conservative approaches to Judaism, but, we have these impulses all the time, right? Where people scream at each other about the pace of stuff, right? Women's equality, right? At the end of the day, right? What's the difference between open orthodoxy and what was once called the right wing of the conservative movement, if there's still anyone left there, right? What's the difference between those two things? Pace, right? And so And that, by the way, that's not an insignificant question. When people say pace dismissively, that's actually a function of not understanding the halachic ethos, because if you do things too fast, you have consequences that are horrible, right? It's not like the conservative movement succeeded in vast numbers in creating, observant egalitarian communities. Why is that? What's the relationship between those things? So again, I think those questions are really, really important and really hard. And there is an important, I think at the end of the day, Judaism is always, the problem of a halachic ethos is, alone, it's not sufficiently dissatisfied with the status quo. This is something that Rav Kook, and with this I'll end, Rav Kook spoke about so beautifully. He basically said, in Israel, we're talking about pre-state Israel, right? In Israel, these secular Zionist socialist utopians, my colleagues, my fellow ultra-Orthodox rabbis, they hate those people because they think they're not frum. But here's the thing. You know why they're not frum? Because they can't tolerate living in an unredeemed world. They have bigger souls than we do. This is not a sentence that was popular, right? He says basically only the small-minded are afraid of those people. Why don't you find a way to bring... Don't you understand? They hate a corrupt civilization. So that's really important religious energy. Marshal it. Don't attack it. So on the one hand, right, if you only have a halachic ethos, you can become, what's the most important question in the world? Is bumblebee kosher? Right? As opposed to, I don't know, look at this building and children continue to die for lack of a malaria net, right? There's a religious question. On the other hand, if all you have is the prophetic, we know what happens in a world in which people think they're going to redeem the world tomorrow. Thomas Sowell, conservative economist, has this wonderful line. It's one of my favorite things I've ever read because it totally changed my view of the world. And I'm not a big fan of a lot of what he has to say. But this is an amazing line. He says, people forget that in this world there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I think that that's really, really sobering. Right? It's really like a sobering thought, and we have to wrestle with that. So in lieu of a closing, I would just say, I think this question of, given that technology can allow us to accomplish good in ways that were unimaginable, antibiotics, and given that technology can enable us to accomplish evil in ways that were unimaginable, right? Nuclear bombs, right? So how do we find ways in our own lives, and through that, by extension, the lives of our children, to really take seriously the power we have to bring healing and to inflict hurt? And how do we actually raise kids who actually believe that their mandate in life, who they are, will be measured not by how much they earn or by what career they have, but whether at the end of the day, when they die, they brought more healing than suffering? And how do we do that in a culture that seems to crowd out that conversation a lot of the time? It's an open question for all of us to struggle with. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.